Peru, 1781. A man is dragged into the main square of Cuzco, forced to his knees before thousands of spectators. His wife, children, and closest allies are already dead, executed while he was forced to watch. Now it's his turn. Spanish authorities prepare to dismember him, using 4 horses pulling in different directions. But before they can begin, he shouts his final words, "I will return and be millions." History is written not just by the victorious, but often in the blood of the defeated. Today, we're exploring 7 executions that weren't just deaths. They were historical inflection points that altered the course of nations, triggered revolutions, and created martyrs whose names echo through centuries. Some you'll recognize, others may shock you. But all of them share one thing in common. After these brutal public killings, the world was never quite the same again. Stay with me until the end to discover the execution that not only changed South American history forever, but inspired a revolutionary movement and even the name of one of music's most iconic figures. Trust me, it's a connection you'd never expect. Let's begin our journey through history's most consequential executions, starting with a Scottish warrior whose death forged a national identity that still burns bright today. London, August 23, 1305. A crowd gathers at Smithfield to witness the execution of a captured rebel, William Wallace, a Scottish knight who dared to challenge King Edward I of England. Wallace had led successful campaigns against English occupation, most famously at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297. But after his capture in 1305, King Edward wanted more than just Wallace's death. He wanted to make an example that would crush Scottish resistance permanently. The execution method chosen was designed specifically to maximize both suffering and public spectacle. Hanging, drawing, and quartering, the punishment reserved for high treason. Wallace was stripped naked and dragged through the streets behind horses for miles, already experiencing tremendous suffering before the execution even began. At Smithfield, he was hanged, but deliberately not to death. While still conscious, he was cut down and laid on a table. What followed was medieval justice at its most barbaric. Wallace was emasculated, his intestines drawn out and burned before his still living eyes. Finally, his heart was removed, and his body quartered, divided into 4 parts to be displayed in Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth as a warning against resistance. King Edward believed this grotesque display would crush Scottish morale and end their independence movement. He could not have been more wrong. Instead of intimidating the Scots, Wallace's execution transformed him from a military leader into something far more dangerous, a martyr and national symbol. His death galvanized Scottish resistance, directly inspiring Robert the Bruce's successful campaign for Scottish independence. 7 centuries later, William Wallace remains Scotland's greatest national hero. The 1995 film Braveheart, though historically inaccurate in many details, captured the emotional truth of Wallace's impact. His execution didn't end Scottish resistance. It enshrined it in the national consciousness for generations to come. As we'll see repeatedly in our countdown, when authorities attempt to make examples through brutal execution, they often create exactly what they're trying to destroy, powerful symbols that outlive them. Paris, July 28, 1794. A cart rolls through jeering crowds toward the guillotine in the Place de la Révolution. In it sits Maximilien Robespierre, his shattered jaw crudely bandaged after a failed suicide attempt the night before. Just days earlier, this man had been among the most powerful figures in revolutionary France, architect of what became known as the Reign of Terror, a period when thousands were executed as enemies of the revolution on often flimsy evidence. Now, Robespierre himself faces the same guillotine he had used so liberally against others. And in a particularly cruel twist of fate, because of his injured jaw, the executioner rips off his bandage before placing him face up on the guillotine, causing him to scream in agony seconds before the blade falls. What makes Robespierre's execution so historically significant isn't just its irony, but how it exposed the cannibalistic nature of revolutionary fervor. The man who had purged so many impure elements from the revolution became himself deemed impure. His death marked the end of the Reign of Terror, during which approximately 17,000 people were officially executed, with thousands more dying in prison or without trial. The French Revolution's most radical phase died with him on that platform. Robespierre's execution teaches a lesson that would repeat throughout history. Revolutions tend to devour their own children. The very mechanisms of purification and justice he had established ultimately consumed him, proving that revolutionary violence, once unleashed, becomes difficult to control or contain. The Thermidorian reaction that followed Robespierre's execution began France's gradual move away from revolutionary radicalism and toward the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. One man's execution marked the end of one historical chapter and the beginning of another. But Robespierre was hardly the first revolutionary figure to meet a violent end. Let's travel back even further to meet a young woman whose fiery execution would transform her from heretic to saint. Rouen, France, May 30, 1431. A 19-year-old girl is led to the marketplace, where a stake surrounded by firewood awaits her. Her name is Joan of Arc, and her crime is heresy, claiming to hear divine voices that instructed her to drive the English out of France. Just 2 years earlier, this peasant girl had led French forces to crucial victories in the 100 Years' War, helping the uncrowned King Charles VII reclaim his throne. But after her capture by Burgundian allies of the English, Joan faced a highly politicized trial, designed to discredit both her and the king she had helped crown. After a grueling interrogation and imprisonment in chains, Joan was condemned as a heretic and sentenced to burn at the stake, one of the most painful execution methods ever devised. Witnesses reported that Joan requested a cross be held before her as the flames rose. She died crying out the name of Jesus, impressing even some of her executioners with her steadfast faith and courage. As a final cruelty, the English burned her body 3 times and scattered her ashes in the Seine River to prevent any collection of relics. But this attempt to erase Joan completely backfired spectacularly. Within 25 years, a retrial cleared her name. By 1456, she was declared a martyr, and in 1920, she was canonized as a Catholic saint. Joan's execution transformed her from a military threat into a powerful religious and patriotic symbol that united France against English occupation. The English had killed a troublesome prisoner, but in doing so, created a transcendent figure whose legacy would inspire French national identity for centuries. The pattern continues. An execution intended to silence opposition instead amplifies it, turning a mortal threat into an immortal symbol. This dynamic between executioners and their victims takes on even greater significance when the condemned is not a rebel or a mystic, but a king. London, January 30th, 1649. A cold winter day finds King Charles I of England stepping through the window of the banqueting house onto a scaffold draped in black. He faces a shocking and unprecedented situation. A reigning monarch about to be executed by his own subjects after a public trial. For centuries, European monarchs had claimed to rule by divine right, the belief that kings were appointed by God and answerable only to him. Charles had embodied this belief, dissolving Parliament when it opposed him and ruling absolutely. This triggered a brutal civil war that ended with his defeat and capture. What followed shattered European political orthodoxy. Parliament put its own king on trial for treason. Charles refused to recognize the court's legitimacy, insisting no earthly authority could judge a divinely appointed king. The court disagreed, sentencing him to death by beheading. Charles's execution was carefully staged. He wore 2 shirts to prevent shivering in the January cold, which might be mistaken for fear. He gave a short speech maintaining his innocence, then placed his head on the block. With one clean stroke, the axeman separated the king's head from his body. According to witnesses, a great groan arose from the crowd. For the first time in modern European history, a reigning monarch had been publicly tried and executed by his subjects. The divine right of kings, a cornerstone of European political thought for centuries, had been decisively challenged. Charles's death ushered in a brief but revolutionary republican experiment in England under Oliver Cromwell. Though monarchy would eventually be restored under Charles's son, the old absolutism was gone forever. The execution established a radical new principle, that rulers could be held accountable by the people they governed. This execution opened the door to modern constitutional government, where power flows from the people rather than from God through a monarch. The blade that fell on Charles's neck cut not just through flesh and bone, but through centuries of political orthodoxy. Our next execution would echo this regicidal theme, the elimination not just of a monarch, but an entire royal dynasty. Yekaterinburg, Russia, July 17, 1918. Shortly after midnight, the deposed Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, their 5 children, and 4 loyal servants are awakened and told to dress quickly. They're led to a small basement room, under the pretext of being moved to a safer location amid the Russian Civil War. Instead, a firing squad enters, and Yakov Yurovsky, the Bolshevik in charge, reads a brief statement. In view of the fact that your relatives continue their offensive against Soviet Russia, the Ural Executive Committee has decided to execute you. Before Nicholas can fully comprehend what's happening, Yurovsky shoots him in the chest. The room erupts in gunfire, smoke, and chaos. What should have been a quick execution becomes a protracted nightmare. The Romanov daughters, who had sewn jewels into their clothing for safekeeping, find these treasures now acting as a primitive form of bulletproof vest. The executioners resort to bayonets and point-blank shots to complete their grim task. Afterward, the Bolsheviks transport the bodies to an abandoned mineshaft, later moving them to a more remote location where they pour acid on the faces and attempt to burn 2 bodies to prevent identification. For decades, the Soviet government denied killing the entire family, claiming only Nicholas had been executed while his family was relocated. The historical impact of this execution was profound. It marked the definitive end of the 304-year Romanov dynasty and Russia's imperial era. The brutal elimination of not just the Tsar but his entire family, including children as young as 13, demonstrated the revolutionary regime's determination to prevent any future restoration. This execution also changed the nature of the Russian Civil War, hardening opposition to the Bolsheviks among many who were shocked by the killing of children and women. Internationally, it crystallized anti-communist sentiment in Western nations and royal houses, many of whom were related to the Romanovs. The secret, intimate nature of this execution, carried out in a basement rather than publicly, and the subsequent cover-up, revealed a new kind of political violence, one that eliminated enemies completely and then attempted to erase them from history itself. But not all royal executions were carried out behind closed doors. Paris, January 21, 1793. A hushed crowd of 20,000 people fills what was once called Place Louis XV, but has been renamed Place de la Révolution. In the center stands the guillotine, the revolution's new instrument of humane execution. At 10:22 a.m., a closed carriage arrives carrying Louis XVI, formerly the absolute monarch of France, now referred to simply as Citizen Louis Capet. Since the storming of the Bastille in 1789, Louis has seen his absolute power stripped away, his palace invaded, and his family imprisoned. Now, convicted of treason, he faces execution. Louis attempts to address the crowd. "I die innocent of all the crimes laid to my charge. I forgive those who have caused my death, and I pray to God that the blood you are about to shed may never be required of France." The revolutionary officials, fearing the impact of his words, order drums to drown him out. Louis is strapped to the board, positioned under the blade, and in an instant, the last king of France is beheaded. A guard lifts Louis's severed head by the hair and shows it to the crowd. The execution of Louis XVI represented a point of no return for the French Revolution. By killing their king, the embodiment of the French state for centuries, the revolutionaries had committed to creating an entirely new political order. The shockwaves were felt throughout Europe. Other monarchies, terrified by the precedent, formed coalitions against revolutionary France. Inside France, the king's execution accelerated the revolution toward its most radical and violent phase. The reign of terror followed within months, as the revolution, having tasted royal blood, developed an insatiable appetite for perceived enemies. This brings us to our final and perhaps most shocking execution, one that continues to resonate through South American history and global popular culture. Cuzco, Peru, May 18, 1781. The Spanish colonial authorities have prepared a spectacle of unprecedented cruelty. José Gabriel Condorcanqui, who had taken the name Tupac Amaru II to claim descent from the last Inca emperor, is about to face execution after leading the largest indigenous rebellion against Spanish rule in colonial history. But first, he must witness the executions of his wife, Micaela Bastidas, his eldest son Hipólito, his uncle Francisco, his brother-in-law Antonio Bastidas, and several captains of his rebel army. This psychological torture is deliberate, designed to break him before his own death. His wife, Michaela, considered by the Spanish to be particularly dangerous for her leadership role, is forced to bite her tongue before being garroted, a cruel method of strangulation. The Spanish authorities then attempt to execute Tupac Amaru II in the most horrific way possible, by quartering, using 4 horses to pull his limbs in different directions. After multiple attempts fail, the horses cannot dismember him. The executioner resorts to beheading him. His body is then torn apart, with parts displayed in different towns across Peru to discourage further rebellion. His houses are demolished, his property confiscated, and salt is scattered on his lands to render them infertile. Despite, or rather because of this excessive cruelty, Tupac Amaru II's execution failed spectacularly in its intended purpose. Rather than suppressing indigenous resistance, it ignited it further. His final words, "I will return and be millions," became prophetic. The rebellion, rather than dying with its leader, spread throughout South America. Within 40 years, Spain would lose most of its American colonies. Tupac Amaru II became the ultimate symbol of indigenous resistance against colonial oppression. His legacy continues to resonate. In the 1960s and 1970s, the Tupamaros guerrilla movement in Uruguay took their name from him. Perhaps most surprisingly, rapper Tupac Shakur was named after Tupac Amaru II by his revolutionary mother, Afeni Shakur, connecting an 18th century Peruvian revolutionary directly to late 20th century American culture. The execution of Tupac Amaru II demonstrates the ultimate backfire of judicial cruelty. The more excessively brutal the punishment, the more powerful the martyr created. These executions changed history not despite their brutality, but because of it. The excessive violence transformed ordinary flesh and blood humans into transcendent symbols that could not be killed by blade or bullet or fire. In trying to eliminate specific threats, these regimes created eternal ones. What do you think? Did any of these deaths truly bring justice? Or did they just spark more bloodshed? Let us know in the comments below. If you found this exploration of history's darkest moments illuminating, we'd love if you'd subscribing for more stories of history's most brutal lessons.